very much for inviting me, Angus. Actually, I shouldn't have said I was invited. It was explained to me that it was such a privilege to be lecturing to this gathering, and I couldn't possibly refuse. When I had actually accepted and was informed that I had to condense Kant's ethics into one lecture, it was too late. It's not something which I have ever done before, and I suspect it's not something I shall ever agree to doing again. But it is nevertheless a topic of the greatest importance to everyone, not to go through life without having understood Kant's ethics. You might as well not have been born. But that's true of a lot of things too. It's true of Shakespeare and Bach and Wagner, and there isn't time to absorb it all, I agree. Nevertheless, this is one thing which has fallen to me to try to introduce you to, and I've thought about it a while, but I think that the only way to do it in the time available is to begin from Kant's general philosophy, the philosophy that's expounded in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is perhaps the most famous book of philosophy written in modern times, and which purports to set limits to our rational inquiry. The Critique of Pure Reason, as the name of the book suggests, argues that we human beings, or we rational beings rather, have the ability to know the truth of our condition, but we also are tempted to think that we can know, as it were, beyond the truth of our condition, that we can reach beyond it and know the world as it is in itself, independently of our own point of view on it. And the Critique of Pure Reason is really devoted to undermining that illusion, saying that, arguing in other words, that we can indeed have knowledge of the world, but it is knowledge of the world from our perspective. In a way that seems obvious. But at the same time, we can only have this knowledge if we have the capacity to reason, and reason constantly tempts us towards the view that we can get beyond our perspective and see the world as a whole and as it is in itself. And that illusion, Kant argues, is responsible for many of the great works of metaphysics, and also for many of the religious thoughts that we have in our unreflective moments. So he starts off the Critique of Pure Reason by arguing that we do indeed have knowledge. We have this knowledge because we have understanding, but understanding depends upon experience. But our experience can produce knowledge only if it is organized in a certain way. And he argues that we organize our experience partly by situating it in space and time, and partly by bringing it under concepts, conceptualizing things. And these concepts are the primary concepts we grasp independently of experience. Okay, we can understand our experience because we apply concepts to it, but the concepts themselves do not result from experience, at least the fundamental ones among them. They are presupposed by experience. They are the concepts that we must have if we are to make sense of our experience at all. So in that case, they can't be derived from experience. They are what he calls a priori concepts. And when we have applied concepts to our experience, we gain knowledge of the world, and the knowledge that comes to us through formulating our experience in the form of propositions that can be true or false. But this knowledge that we have of the world shows us the world as a phenomenon, but not as what he calls a noumenon. A phenomenon is something revealed to the senses. A noumenon is a purely intellectual object, something that can be thought, but which can't be experienced. And his argument is essentially that we can only know the world as phenomenon and not as noumenon. He has another language for putting this, which is perhaps more pellucid to us now. He argues that we can know the world empirically, and we can know empirical truths, say truths that can be confirmed by experience, but we can't have knowledge of the transcendental, that which transcends experience. And he has a name for this thing that transcends experience. The name is the thing in itself. Objects are entities that are conceived independently of our own point of view on them. And his argument is that we can get just so far in our knowledge of the world, organising it according to scientific categories and space and time, but we can't get beyond that to know the world as a transcendental object, an object that transcends experience. But now, that probably doesn't make any sense to you, or did it? Yes? Okay, that's a summary of the Critique of Pure Reason in 5 minutes. If it is settled in your mind, it enables me to give an account of what the principal question that we're dealing with today might be. It starts from the problem, as you might put it, the problem of the subject. Given that picture of the world, where am I? Where am I in all that? Now, you can imagine a thought experiment. Imagine a perfect system of scientific inquiry, which gave you an account of all the laws of nature, and which also gave you a description of all the fundamental particles of the universe. So it described everything that there is. And you are looking at this description, and you say, this is the whole world. You still have a question, which of the things in this world is me? How would you answer that question? Of course, you can find perhaps a description of a particular human body in it, but what makes that body your body? Where are you in all this? The scientific description doesn't mention any particular point of view, does it? That's the whole point of science, to escape from your point of view and describe the world in something like a perspectiveless way. But even in Kant's vision of the world as a phenomenal realm, a realm of objects of experience, there still is an equivalent of the same question. Where in that realm am I? I'm not an object in the phenomenal world. I'm not a piece of furniture. I'm not something that I can come across in space and time. And one reason for saying that is, of course, that I know things about myself which I could never know about an object. I know, for instance, that I have a pain in my foot at the moment, and that I'm thinking about the people in this room, and also wondering whether I'm going to manage to get through this lecture without making terrible howlers. Now, those three truths about me I know without having to look at anything in the empirical world, and I know that they are truths about one thing. There's only one thing that is involved in those three propositions about myself. So I know that I'm a unity of consciousness. That's how he puts it. But also, it's not a unity of consciousness of a kind that I could come across as I come across you. So where am I? It's as though I'm on the edge of the world. I am the thing that is processing all the information, but I'm not an object of its own processing. I am the thing that's thinking this world, but I'm not the thing that is thought in the world. So the self seems to exist on the edge of things. And yet if I didn't think of myself in this unified way, as a creature which has all these different mental states at one and the same time, then Kant thinks I couldn't really begin the enterprise of having any knowledge at all. So it's only because I am this unified self, which is the subject of experience, that I can have knowledge of objects at all. So that's another aspect of the critique of pure reason, which is vital to his thinking. And it's summarized in a phrase that he uses, the transcendental unity of apperception. That's it's a piece of jargon, but it's stuck in the philosophical dictionary. Apperception means self-consciousness, the term from Leibniz. Unity, you understand. Transcendental here has a very special meaning. It means that this unity of self-consciousness is presupposed in all my experience. If it weren't there, I couldn't have experience at all. So it's not something which I conclude. It's not a conclusion I come to. It's something which, as it were, transcends all my attempts to gain knowledge, partly because it's presupposed in all those attempts. So that's his vision of the subject, this thing on the edge of its world, which has knowledge of that world, but is not an item in the world. So is it something else? That's the great question. Descartes famously thought that the subject is therefore something else. It's not part of the material world at all. It's a different kind of object, a spiritual object. And Kant says of that argument that that is completely wrong, that we must see the subject not as another kind of object, but as a point of view upon the world of objects. It's not an item in the world, but the thing that looks at the world, so to speak. So there isn't a thing called the self, yet it is, in another sense, that which I fundamentally am. Now, how do you make sense of that idea? Something which I fundamentally am, but which I can never come across as I come across you, or tables and chairs and so on. It's something which is on the edge of my world, in something like the way that the edge of my visual field is there. Something which I can't find in the world. If I try to turn around, as it were, and seize my own self, looking at things, then all I do is become, as it would take up another point of view. I'm still in that point of view that I'm taking up. So I could never make myself an object of my own awareness. I'm always a subject of it. But now there's another aspect to this. Yeah, has that mystified you sufficiently? I mean, if you think about it, it's actually one of those thoughts which you probably had. You probably had it in the, those frightening moments in the bath when nothing seems to be before you except thinking. And you have thoughts like that. Yeah. Where in this world am I? And what happens to me if the world is taken away, and so on. Right, so Kant thought that there's another aspect to this position that I occupy as a subject, and that is the aspect that he called transcendental freedom. When I'm in this state of reflecting self-consciously on the world seems to lie before me as an open arena in which my actions are possible. There lies before me a field of activity, and I always have the question what to do. Just as I have the question what to think, question what I'm feeling, and so on, I have this other, really much more interesting question, what to do about it. Now maybe there are people who have sufficient moral indolence that they never asked that question. But most of you must have asked it, otherwise you'd never have got here in the first place. There was some existential crisis which persuaded you that you really had to attend one of Claire Fox's subject yourself to the kind of things that occur there. Even if it was a mistake, nevertheless it was a mistake that you made, nobody else. So at a certain stage you were free to make it. The question, it was open to you to do it or not. And the question is, how do you answer that question? Here Kant said, we do find, again, that reason is involved, but this is a legitimate use of reason. Remember, in my 5-minute summary of the Critique of Pure Reason, he argued that the use of reason to try to understand the world from no point of view is an illegitimate use. And he tried to show that it will always end in contradiction. But he says there is a legitimate use of reason, which is the practical use, the use that we make of it when we answer the question, what shall I do? And this question is essentially addressed to the subject. That's why this is part of our position as subjects in the world of objects. That question only arises in the first person case. It only arises for me, rather, in the first person case. What shall I do? And it's addressed to me as an individual. Now, of course, I don't only see myself as an individual chooser. I have another vision of myself. I also see myself as part of nature. I'm a human being like you, and as a part of nature, I have a body, a biology. I'm bound by the laws of nature, and all kinds of things go on in me of which I have no knowledge. They're going on at this moment. And maybe you could have better knowledge of them than I have. For instance, you might be a doctor who's been studying my symptoms and saying, yes, indeed, he's got perhaps the first stages of Parkinson's or whatever. So you might actually know more about me than I do just by looking at me. Because that kind of knowledge is knowledge of me as an object, not as a subject. But we do distinguish these two different visions that we have of ourselves. And you can see what Kant has in mind if you contrast different kinds of statement about your own future. Suppose someone asks you, what are you going to do tonight at the party? Are you going to get drunk again? Or not? And you could reply by saying, well, looking at my past conduct, it does seem pretty likely. But that's like it's predicting something, and I'm no better, say, at predicting things in that respect than you are. So I'm seeing myself as part of nature, governed by causal laws. But I could also say to you in reply, well, actually, you think I'm going to get drunk because I'm a weak character. But actually, I've decided to get drunk in order to show my strength. So I've made a decision to do so. And you might say, well, why on earth do that? And I might reply, well, I'm always being nagged about it by you, but I'm now going to do it in a complete defiance of you, just to show you've got to take me seriously. Now, I've given you reasons. I'm not justifying a prediction as I would in any kind of scientific inquiry. I've given myself reasons for action. They're not very good reasons, but they support a decision. So can you see the contrast between these two cases? We're always making this contrast, actually, between those matters about which we regard ourselves simply as objects among others, and therefore we predict what we're going to do and try and understand ourselves scientifically, and those matters where we give up on the whole idea of prediction and seeing ourselves in this scientific way, and actually take charge of things. So look, I'm going to do this, and I make a decision, and I give myself reasons for it. And Kant's thought was that this division is absolutely fundamental to our condition and corresponds to the division between object and subject. I can see myself as an object swept along by the laws of nature just like everything else, but I can also step back from that and say, no, I'm not just that, I am a subject, I am an I, something which has a privileged perspective on its own world and which can take charge of that world by taking decisions. And when I take decisions, I'm guided not by my own bodily processes, but by my will. And my will is answerable to reason, not to science. And that is a very important observation, which you may think it needs a bit of proof, but nevertheless it corresponds to our way of actually being in the world. We wouldn't be able to find our way around the world, and especially find our way around human relations, if we didn't have this stance towards the world of taking responsibility for the outcome of our own choices and basing them in our reasons. Right, so this is where Kant's morality begins. He says that in that case, we recognize that we as subjects are can act in obedience to reason, and in doing so, we're not acting or not behaving as mere objects do, but we are the originators of our own actions. And when I have a reason for doing something and then decide to do it, I have originated my own action. I have obeyed reason. And I can only do that because I am free to do so. I have, as it were, asserted my freedom in the realm of nature. Now, how is this possible? How is it possible for me to be an object among objects and still free? Kant has a very interesting thought in response to that. He says that actually the understanding, which, in other words, our understanding of the world as it is, as a system of causal laws and so on. The understanding can't actually grasp this. But we don't need to grasp it because we know it is true independently. Our reason tells us that it is true. Our reason tells us that we have freedom. And we know this with the same kind of certainty that we know that, that this thing that I gesture to has now got a pain in its foot. It is not something that I need to have evidence for. It is something that's given to me with my self-knowledge, this certainty that I am free. But the understanding stops at the threshold of this certainty and can't make sense of it. But that doesn't matter. Why should one be able to make sense of everything? And Kant's trying to suggest that this is one of those places where, in fact, there couldn't be such a thing as making sense of it. It has to be accepted for what it is and how it presents itself. Well, that's something perhaps to go back to. But he thinks that from this thought he can derive a commonsensical morality that we all instinctively accept anyway. All rational beings accept it. The first point that he wants to emphasize is that we are, when we listen to reason, we are listening to something which is law-like, something which gives us laws for justifying our action. And these laws come to us as necessary. They seem to be things that we cannot but act upon. And suppose somebody says to you, his example, that if you do a certain thing, you will gain a great deal of pleasure. There's a wonderful feast awaiting you in the next room. But of course, you'll have to pay for this by being savagely beaten afterwards. Most of you say, well, in that case, I won't do it. You balance the good and evil against itself, or the cost and benefit against itself, in all your ordinary practical reasonings. But when it comes to morality, we have a different kind of prospect confronting us. If somebody said to you that here you have a decision to make, you must betray your friend or tell some devastating lie or whatever, otherwise you're going to be beaten in a thrash in some terrible way. You might say, well, look, I'm a weak person, I will betray my friend, but you'll know that you've been doing wrong. It wouldn't be a question of balancing the costs and the benefits here. You might be persuaded by the threat to do something like betray your friend or engage in some equivalent immorality, but it will always weigh upon you as something that you ought to have done. You can't just cancel it out by calculation. And this thought is what Kant tried to develop into a complete system of morality. That when it comes to moral thinking, we are confronted with absolute and necessary laws which bind us irrespective of what we want and irrespective of any of our self-interested calculations. And most people, when they think about it, recognize that this is true. Of course, well, we always try to slip out of our moral obligations and say, well, they're not really obligations. We try and rewrite them so that they don't have quite the force that we thought they had. But once they are before us and accepted as moral laws or moral commandments, then we recognize that there's no getting out of them. To go against them is possible, of course, because we are free beings. But in doing so, we are also committing a crime or putting ourselves in the wrong position vis-à-vis ourselves. So this peculiar feature of the moral law, that it is necessary, is something which he wanted to explain. And his thought was, it's necessary because it is indeed reason that leads us to it. And all the things that reason leads us to are necessary and not universal necessary matters rather than merely contingent and empirical. To explain this, he made a famous distinction between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. which again is very familiar from your ordinary reasoning. If I say to you, if you want to enjoy yourself this evening, then you should go for a walk around the lake. That is a piece of advice which has weight for you only to the extent that you accept that you want to enjoy yourself. The if makes it into a hypothetical imperative. It's telling you to do something only on a certain condition. But, Kant says, moral imperatives are not like that. They are all categorical. They say you ought to do something. Not if you want X or Y you ought to do it, but you just ought to do it. It has a kind of absolute and incontrovertible character, and that is what we need to explain. How is it that we, rational beings, can constantly come up against these strange imperatives which don't refer to our desires or our interests or anything else? They just stand there immovably in our worldview, as it were, telling us what we must do or what we can't do, without our being able to do anything about it except simply accept them. Well, not everybody does accept them, of course, but Kant thinks that, in fact, all rational beings, if they open their minds to this, will be led in the direction that he recommends. And this is the direction that he calls that of the categorical imperative. Now, he imagines the following thought. You are faced with the question what to do, and you know you have a choice. You can go one of two ways. And if you are faced with that question, the first thing that you ask yourself is what should be the maxim governing my action? What should be the principle governing my action? The principle that my reason would be able to accept, so that it would be justified in my eyes. And we always do this when we're thinking about some serious decision. We think of what the principle would be upon which we take the decision. Simply to take it on no principle at all, like tossing a coin or whatever, is to avoid the rational choice. But of course we don't really avoid it, even by doing that. But to make a choice genuinely rational, and one from which we're genuinely responsible, and in which our freedom is fully exercised, we must have the principle through which we can rationalize it. So what form should this principle take? Kant says, well, if it is going to be a genuinely rational principle, it must appeal to reason alone, not to my special conditions. It shouldn't refer just to my interests or my desires, because then it would just be a hypothetical imperative. If I didn't have those interests or those desires, then the principle wouldn't have any weight for me. If it's to have the proper weight for me as a truly rational principle, so it's reason alone motivating me, then it must be, as it were, abstracted from all my individuating conditions, all the conditions that make me different from you. In other words, it must be a principle that I could offer to you too, equally, in the same predicament as me. It must be a maxim that I can will as a law for all rational beings. That's what he says, to summarize his categorical imperative. This is how he thinks morality must work if it is to perform its function of presenting these categorical imperatives. It must be founded upon a law or maxims that I can will for others as well as myself. I can will them as laws that bind people universally. And he thinks that's just a philosophical way of saying something which is also said by the great religions, at least by Christianity, Islam and Judaism, namely that we should act that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto ourselves. Right? That we should, in other words, the golden rule that most religious people feel they're obliged to follow. Not to make exceptions in your own case. Always to act upon that principle which you could recommend to another. Now, Kant thinks that once you've started thinking in that way, other principles follow, as it were, like a shadow behind this one. Two in particular are very important. Since we have to think in terms of reason being a motive for all of us, this means that we must respect reason in all of us. We mustn't just regard other human beings as though they were animals or instruments for our purpose. We must regard them as rational beings too, and that means respecting them in a certain way, respecting them as rational beings, offering them reasons to do what we want them to do, rather than just compelling them to do so. Right? So this is something that is incumbent upon us as rational beings. In other words, that we don't try to force people to do things. We reason with them and see if they can accept our reasons. And if they can't, they might persuade us. So that's how we should deal with each other. Not as mere objects or mere instruments, but as rational beings. And he put this in a very poetic way. He said that the categorical imperative also tells us that we should treat rational beings, in ourselves as well as in others, as ends and not as means only. It's a very poignant way of putting it, because he never really tells us what it is to treat someone as an end, but we know what it is to treat someone as a means. Slavery, rape, murder, robbery, etc., all are very transparently ways of treating people as mere objects for our own use. But what is it to treat them as an end? He left that question in the air, and its poetic reverberation has been felt down the centuries since. He also thought that the categorical imperative could be formulated in another way, in terms of what he called a kingdom of ends, another poetic expression, that we should act as though the maxim governing action were a law of nature in a kingdom of ends. In other words, as though we should act as though our principles could be used to lay down the legislation for an ideal world. We should always act as though our principles could really serve as ideals in some perfect world. All these are just three ways in which he formulates the categorical imperative, but he believes, and I think he was right, that they correspond to intuitions that we all have. We all have them, at least when we're being serious with each other, which is not very often. But in those vital conversations on the edge of divorce, you will find yourself using just these principles. And with any luck, you'll come back from that edge as a result. That's what Kant would say anyway. So, now, thanks, I've got a few more minutes. Is it okay so far? Yeah, right, okay. And then I can move on from Kant a little bit. Just one last direct thought about him. His view is that this system of morality would, first of all, corresponds to the moral thinking of all ordinary decent people anyway. They don't necessarily formulate it in this philosophical way, but it's there in their thinking and guiding them insofar as they are serious beings, because that's what freedom consists in. But he also believed that all of morality depends upon the exercise of the will. And the will is the most important feature of the human being, to which we refer whenever we're making moral judgments. And he even says that there is nothing absolutely good in this world or out of it, save a good will. He says that's what makes the difference between a good person and a bad person. Somebody could have all the benefits that we can imagine in the form of wealth and status and looks and so on, but if he has not a good will with it, this makes him so much the worse. And likewise, he could lack all those benefits, but having a good will, that would be enough to make him a good person that he is. Now, the will, however, can be corrupted. And Kant has a very interesting thought about this. He says that the really good will is what he calls autonomous. It's a will which wills its own actions as a law for itself. Let's say, well, rather, it wills its own actions according to law. It finds its motive within itself. And that's what happens when we consult the categorical imperative. We're finding the motive of the will within the will. within pure practical reason. But a will becomes corrupted when it becomes, as he puts it, heteronymous. That's to say, instead of being its own law, it takes its law from something else, in particular from appetite, from the appetites of the body, or from the ambitions and interests which don't have any moral force. And you can see the difference here, he thinks, if you contrast the behaviour of a shopkeeper who, out of self-interest, is always honest with his customers. He knows that if he's not honest, they're not going to come back. So it's in his interest to be honest. That is somebody who is not acting from the moral law. He's simply acting in accordance with the moral law. His will is actually governed by his own self-interest rather than by morality. The shopkeeper, however, who behaves honestly to his customers, even in a time when of crisis, when of course that he's being cheated by them, but nevertheless feels that he has no option but to treat them honestly, because that's what the moral law requires. He is somebody who is acting autonomously. His will is autonomous and not governed by any interest outside itself. He is the truly moral person, the one who is acting from the moral law rather than merely in accordance with it. We know this distinction in our everyday life too. It's a distinction between morality and legality. You know, we all of us obey the law because it's in our interest to do so. Some of us would possibly obey the law even if it weren't in our interest to do so. But that's where the real test lies, isn't it? How you behave when the Nazis or the communists take over. What are you going to do then when it's no longer in your interest to obey the moral laws which you feel are binding on you? Right, now where does this leave us then? I've got a few minutes. I want to say something about what the relevance of Kant is to us today. But obviously I've been engaging in a certain amount of special pleading. I haven't allowed him to appear as an 18th century eccentric living in Königsberg. I've presented him very much as though he were a member of this audience, although slightly more articulate. And that's how I'd like you to think of him. He's somebody who did actually formulate many of the ideas which govern the modern world, or govern the decent people in the modern world, let's say, rather than those who are interested only in power relations. He made these important distinctions between the subject and the object. He argued that we are all subjects and are also all objects, but the subject is not something other than the object. It's like a way of seeing the object. And you can see what he had in mind if you think of a picture, a portrait in oils of somebody there, of Kant. You know, it consists of various pigments spread upon a canvas, but you see in it the face of the philosopher. But the face of the philosopher appears to you there not because it's something else. It's not something other than those pigments on the canvas. It's just something that you're seeing in a completely different way. You're seeing it under the aspect of the person and the aspect of freedom. And that's something like that goes on when in your own life. You can see yourself as your doctor sees you on the operating table. You know, as that complicated object which is being getting through things from cradle to grave. Or you can see that yourself in the way that you do when you're making these fundamental choices, in which case you're seeing yourself as a subject, and seeing yourself in a completely different way, so that you're as it were, taking up position on the edge of things, and not in the middle of them. Do you see that? I mean, I know it's only a metaphor, but that's the kind of thing he's trying to say. And it comes out in the distinction I made already between predicting and deciding, between explaining something, as a doctor does, and justifying it through reasons. These distinctions are absolutely fundamental to us, and they are connected with another distinction between the animal and the person. And Kant is famous really for using this concept of the person to define what it was that he was trying to say. He was trying to put across the idea that a modern morality is a morality of persons. We're seeing each other as persons, taking each other seriously as persons. That means not treating each other as animals, but giving each other that special position in each other's world which we reserve for the free being. So that behind this, there's emerging a concept of the person which has entered all our moral and political thinking at least in European civilization ever since. Let me just finish with a few thoughts about this. A person is a thing that can refer to itself in the first person case. You know, there's something like you and me which can say I of itself. And in doing so, take up this position on the edge of things that I've been talking about. Such a creature can engage in special kinds of relation that occurs between an I and a you. The I and you relation is something that's absolutely familiar to you, and you know it, and not just through the way you talk to each other, but also the way you look at each other, the gestures you make towards each other, and the fact that when you're confronted with another person, you're automatically put in a position of accountability. That person doesn't stand before you as an object does, he stands before you as another subject, and you have to account to yourself for him. You can't just knock him over without giving reason, and nor can you simply ignore what he says or what he does without trying in some way to give him a satisfactory view of why you are doing so. So that there arises between persons this kind of continuous dialogue through which they engage with each other, try to alter each other's conduct through reasoning rather than through force, and through which they allocate to each other a kind of individual space, a space which each of them occupies, from which he addresses the world. And this space is what we summarize in the concept of a right. You know, there is all of us have rights. That's a thing, a sphere of interest which cannot be invaded without being wrong. You have a right a free movement, which I can't prevent you from doing without invading your rights and therefore wronging you. And we think in these terms in all our everyday dealings, and also in our political dealings too, that there are certain things that you can't do to people because they are persons. Not because it might be in their interests to do it. You might think that it really would be useful to pick this person up and throw him into the pond. But you can't do it because he's a person. And our lives are full of these interdictions which create around each of us a wall of protection which can't be breached without our consent. And you can see why this emerges, isn't it? That the whole point of having rights is that it means that when we do have relations with each other, they are based on consent and not on force. So what has emerged in the world of humanity, and because it is a world of persons, is a community based upon consultation, consent, compromise, and so on. But all this depends upon that our being able to take up that special perspective on the edge of things, which Kant called the transcendental unity of our perception. So the amazing thing is that all those technicalities that Kant puts before us actually have their, if you like, their political result in the kind of social order of which we are the beneficiaries. I know we all complain, everybody complains about the surrounding political order and the injustices of it and the fact that, and the grievances that you all have, otherwise you wouldn't be here, presumably, because you're looking for compensation for them. Nevertheless, we know very well that we're, if we think about it, that we're incredibly lucky to live in a world where each of us does enjoy rights, which are not simply the rights laid down by law, but the rights that we all acknowledge in our dealings with each other, because we actually live in a community founded upon consent. And that is really what Kant was getting at, that the moral law is what makes this possible. The moral law makes it possible for us to live in communities, consensual communities. But it only does so because we obey it with the kind of absolute force that he, or it has for us, the kind of absolute force that he said it has. But that's it. Now you're allowed to ask questions, apparently.
Okay, who'd like to ask questions, apparently or really? Dennis, so there are a couple of microphones going around, so Jason, you're going to ask Dennis. Thanks.
Well, I don't agree with your perception of morality or what Kant is. And it does seem to me that when you make a moral judgment, it isn't putting your judgment under some sort of motto or maxim, but actually asking the question, what's right to do in this case? And Kant, early on in the Critique, makes this point that examples of the go-kart of the human understanding, and if you lack the faculty of judgment, you can't go beyond them. It seems to me he's entirely wrong. And the way that if you're a real human being, it isn't the case that you, in a very simplistic and mechanical way, find some principle that you're applying. And even if you are applying a general principle, you have to apply it with judgment to each particular case, not just marginal cases. And it often happens in legal cases where somebody's done something that's technically wrong, and you can agonise over whether they're guilty or not, and perhaps make judgments against it. And it's not just on marginal cases. I mean, the superficial abstraction and sweeping things under an imperative allows you to make it seem really simple. And I would argue that just functioning according to maxims, not in the cynical way of your shopkeeper, but doing it generally, is to avoid moral judgments. It's actually to avoid what makes us most human, which is to decide in this particular case, without reference to general principles, whether it's the right thing to do.
We're going to take a few, but
right.
Show when if you want to come back in particular. Over at the back, like Corona. I'll walk down.
I don't come bearing a grudge, and I'm not looking for compensation. Although if anyone wants to refund me my train fare, that's cool. I have a question more about the historical aspect of your thought. You're saying, or you seem to present, I think, a sort of timeless, in my mind, I'm thinking a sort of timeless elements for Kant's thinking. And from my very limited reading, his notes on history seems to presenting history as just a random series of events. There's no great order. There's certainly no telos like there is there in Hegel. So I think what I'm saying is, if the morality of the society we enjoy is latent in all human societies, is that proposition you'd agree with? And if it's not, how or in what way would the elements of Kant's philosophy be generalised outside Protestant European culture?
Okay, keep passing it down. I'll do this side a bit first. So Tamandra, and then Russell and Leslie.
I was very struck by the phrase, my will is answerable to reason, not to science, mainly because there's a trend at the moment to kind of try and elide reason and science and suggest that those two things can cover everything, including morality. So I wonder if you could make a distinction between the kind of reason that tells us what a categorical imperative is and what we should follow, and the science which describes the world of objects.
We'll take a couple more, if that's all right, Roger. So Russell, next to you, Tamandra. Right next to you. Yep.
I believe I'm a good guy and do things well. I wonder whether God's given me the gift to see myself as others see me, according to Robbie Burns.
let's take just feed.
I'm not quite sure what that question was.
God give us the gift to see ourselves as others see us.
Oh, right, yes.
Just a question about what did Kant say, if anything, about the impact that breaking the bond of consent that exists between people via, for example, coercion has? What impact does that make upon being reasonable or rational? Does it result in irrationality? Or I'm just not sure about that. Thanks.
Okay, and Josephine, and that'll be the left wing then. And Roger, you can come back in.
You were talking about the concept of a person, and my concept of a person is that you can't have a person without the social. And you talked about you can refer to yourself in the first person, I, or can engage in the special relations, I and you, and that is where you become accountable. So I just wondered how you viewed the social, because you kind of went through the I and you and the accountable and categorical imperatives, which I believe is the social. There are universal rights, and then there's my right to my own opinion, which I wouldn't say was necessarily universal. How do you balance the I in there and the social? Because I don't think the true subject, there is such a thing as a true subject without the social. Does that make sense?
Is that it?
Yeah, well, for now.
Yes, well, these are very good questions, and I wish Kant were here to answer. I will do my best to answer it on his behalf. Obviously, in many ways, intellectually the most important of these is the first one from Dennis, who argues that moral judgment, he argued with a certain feeling as though he had a personal reason for saying this, that moral judgment is not a matter of universal maxims, but rather of reasoning to the particular case. What is right and wrong in this case might not be what is right and wrong in some other similar seeming case, because all the details have to be called in. I would say, although this is extremely difficult, there's a whole school of philosophy that does think that this is an objection to Kant. I would say that in the end, it is not an objection, that of course it is true that the working out of the universal maxim through the details of the particular case might lead to incredibly fine distinctions. But it is the working out of a universal maxim that will do this. And I think if you look at the exercise of the common law in English law, you will see this process in action. In English common law judgments, before the disease of the European Union hit us, where our judges would have to decide each case on its merits, taking into consideration whatever precedents they were. And if they want to come to a different decision from the precedent, they would have to distinguish the case. Say that there is something about this case which is different, which therefore ensures that we don't, or we shouldn't apply that previous maxim. And that's another way of saying that, therefore, we are looking for another maxim for this case, because it's only on the strength of that distinction, of having actually found a distinction in the quality of the case, rather than it being the individual that it is, that you can say that it should be decided otherwise. So if you look at the structure of common law reasoning, it does follow something like the Kantian paradigm. At least that's what I think. And it's one reason why our system of justice has been so successful, that it has been responsive to individual cases. Now, the second question from the gentleman who said he had no grudge, he said, to what extent is this philosophy as timeless as it represents itself as being? This is another very serious objection, that Kant obviously presented his philosophy as the timeless universal truth about human nature, and people will respond as you did, that, oh no, this is simply an expression of a particular Protestant consciousness that emerged in Germany at the time of the Enlightenment and has since been superseded. Again, I think that Kant at least would say, no, that is not true, that what varies is the application of this. That of course is true, that our moral thinking delivers different results in different social contexts, as it inevitably must. But ultimately, there is this foundation which all humanity shares. And if you think of that second formulation of the categorical imperative, you know, to treat humanity as an end and never as a means only, that is something that, of course, is often disobeyed in history, but it's always pushing through the envelope of people's desires, making itself felt throughout the Old Testament and through the things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, where people treat each other very differently. It's still pushing itself through and saying, you know, that this is how people should behave to each other, even if they don't. Somebody asked the question, a lady asked a question about the relation between the kind of reason I've been talking about, or Kant talks about, and scientific reasoning, and what they have in common and what distinguishes them. And I think this is, again, another very important question. Of course, goes to the heart of Kant's philosophy, and that he wants to argue, and I agree with him, that reason has different applications, that we reason towards the truth of things by scientific experiment and through construction of theories. In the case of the moral life, we don't proceed by experiment and theory building. If we did, we'd end up treating each other in the most horrible way. We proceed in a completely different way by finding rational answers to practical questions. So the question what to believe has a scientific answer. The question what's to do has a practical answer. And these are, but they are both equally rational processes. And the question is there an ultimate foundation for practical reason? We know there's an ultimate foundation for scientific reason, which is the concept of truth and the correspondence with reality. But in the case of practical reason, and Kant was perhaps saw this more clearly than anyone else, we're not talking about correspondence with reality. We're not talking about the actual world. We're talking about how the world ought to be, the ideal world, the kingdom of ends. We can't justify our moral beliefs by exploring the world and seeing whether it corresponds to them. We have to justify them in another way, in terms of ideal worlds rather than actual worlds. Somebody said, I guess a quotation from Burns, of course we should see ourselves as others see us. That is another way of putting the underlying metaphysics of Kant's position here. Yes, what happens when we break the bond of consent by coercion? Does that lead to an irrationality? I think, if I understand the question rightly, it's really asking whether what is it that actually persuades me that I shouldn't do that? I suppose I can enslave someone or can coerce someone to my will. Why shouldn't I do it? Is it just that it's a contradiction or an irrationality to do this? In which case, why respect reason? This is again a deep question. Has Kant really identified a motive rather than simply a way of describing what we do? Have we really got a motive to obey reason? That's his thought. And Kant wants to say that reason is itself a motive to action. Many moral philosophers say no. This can only work if there is also another structure of motivation which pushes us in the direction of reason. And I'm inclined to think that is partly true. That although we do and have to think in terms of this kind of calculus of rights and duties that Kant puts before us, that calculus only has weight for us because we are also sympathetic beings who feel the impulse to be accepted by the fellow members into our community. That is really the answer to the last question. that this I concept, the self concept, requires a social context. My own view of the matter, this is not talking for Kant at the moment, but my own view of the matter is that put forward by Hegel, which is essentially that the Kantian morality is what we human beings emerge in, as accepting in the end. That's where full self-consciousness comes to fruition. But we can only get to that point through social coordination. And Hegel's view is indeed we get there through conflict, and the conflict is resolved finally in the categorical imperative. But the categorical imperative is always marked by that conflict as a kind of archaeological residue. And that may be true, but it's another topic.
Okay, we'll take another round. Can I throw one in as well? Just to try and link back to the session we had on Luther and his defiance and the theories of resistance that started to develop once you had a concept of subjectivity in here in the world out there. And I'm thinking about what you said, Roger, about the honest shopkeeper, the autonomously honest shopkeeper who keeps shop dutifully because it's his duty to keep shop, not out of any self-interest, and therefore gets ripped off by his customer. So does this honest shopkeeper have a right to resist what's going on, or should he just suffer the abuses, the evil that men do in his heart as sort of a silent witness to that, which is sort of what Luther was saying about princes do evil things, but you should obey nonetheless. It seems a bit of a shame for the honest shopkeeper that he's worse off than the honest shopkeeper who has a surrender. That was my point. Take Helen in front, and then move up there.
This may be a bit of a basic question, but when Kant says that you cannot know the objective world as the objective world, you can only know it from your own subjective standpoint. How does that really work in his philosophy? Because when he talks about the categorical imperative, he uses abstraction to sort of strip away the self-interest of individuals and therefore can find something common to all individuals. And I don't understand why he says that you cannot understand the world through abstraction and develop a general understanding of the world through abstracting from the subjective to have a more objective understanding. When I read it, I just couldn't understand that.
You pass it back to Mike.
Okay, so I want to ask you to pursue the question of what is social that other people have raised, and you start to talk about the relationship at the end. You were talking about the relationship between Kant and Hegel's analysis of Kantian morality and the role of social coordination in the playing out of that morality. And I suppose what I'm interested in is it simply that Kant's philosophy is operating at a level of abstraction such that it doesn't address particular social forms, and then latterly Hegel does indeed there's a level of elaboration in which you're beginning to address the social, and then there's a different kind of elaboration later in Marx. So is it simply a question of Kant's ideas being prior, and operating in that abstract way, or is it that that there's a different idea of what the social is in Kant that's fundamentally different in Hegel and then in Marx?
Next to you, and then John.
Thank you for your talk, first of all. And I suppose evidently we owe so much to Kant on subjectivity, and then also we owe something to you for your very fine exegesis of him. But I think in 20th century philosophy we find kind of three major things that problematize this idea of a subjectivity in Kant, and those would be, first of all, kind of Bergsonian phenomenology, and the idea that we don't have to have this divide anymore between the mind and then the things that are outside of the mind because of the principle of intentionality, that consciousness is always directed towards something, so we don't have to say anymore there's me and then there's a tree in the world that I perceive, but my perception of the tree can't be then separated into the perceiver on the one hand and the tree on the other. And then the second thing would be about the problem of the subject and the other. I really like this fantastic quote by Lacan, that there is no sexual relation, and what he's trying to get at is that if the other is an object and we are subject, there can never be intersubjectivity. And I think that has ramifications ethically for Kant, or for our understanding of Kant. You know, this idea we can't do certain things to somebody else because they're a person. Well, are they? There's only one subject for the subject, and that is the self. And then just the third thing would be obvious, I'm sure, Heidegger. And Kant talks about being, but not really about time. And then we have this massive breakthrough with Heidegger that our mode of existence, of worldly existence, is structured by time and our thrownness in time. And I think that's why all the great 20th century novelists are preoccupied with time, not so much because of the wars, but because we realise that our being is absolutely rooted in a sense of this time, this being unto something.
Okay, so the question's getting hard, so I'm going to get two more. I'll take two more, but start getting them a little bit quicker, if you can. I mean, Roger can do the whole thing in 5 minutes, so a little bit more. So we'll take Joel, and then Bruno at the back, and then we'll come back out again after Roger to take the rest.
Thank you. Given the amount of time you had, I thought you spent quite a good amount of time on freedom, which is understandable given that this is a focus of this academy. But I'm struck thereby that you nonetheless left the other two postulates of practical reason aside. And I wonder whether you think you did that because you think Kant's moral philosophy holds together without the postulate of God and the postulate of immortality. And if you think it holds together without those things, why doesn't Kant see that?
Bruno in the back, and then Roger.
I find the Kantian ideal, as you formulated it, is a very attractive one, and it's one that sort of takes you forward into some interesting areas, in the sense that if one is an I in the Kantian sense, can I become a we with others who are also pursuing that ideal? And what happens in the situation of a conflict in a community where that we, of those people who are self-consciously pursuing the Kantian ideal of moral, of an autonomous will, a majority clashes with a minority who want to corrupt that will, who quite actively instrumentalise, maybe through state or through property arrangements, whatever, through legal forms, who want to instrumentalise the corruption of the will. Does that majority of Kantian idealists have the right to impose their will in the interests of the progress of moral choice?
All I can say is you can't. Jack's very lucky to have me to defend. I'm used to it. There's this Okay, starting with Angus's question, what about the honest shopkeeper who is being exploited by his customers and is obviously going to be driven out of business? Does he have the right to resist? And you refer to Luther's thoughts about obligation to obey the princes. Now, I think this isn't a special question for Kant. I mean, this is a question for all moral philosophers. When do you have the right to resist other people's wrongdoing? And what kind of actions are you entitled to take? I would say that actually the law has developed some very cogent answers to this. You know, that you can't use violence other than that which is necessary to protect ourselves from violence and so on. And in the case of the honest shopkeeper, he has the right to take his business elsewhere or not to do business with the customers who are cheating him. Whether it doesn't follow from that he has a right to cheat them in return, and I think we'd all agree with that. So that you know, there are circumstances in which it is impossible to be an honest shopkeeper. So you have to be an honest something else. But there are certain professions which it's not possible to be an honest member of at all. Whether the oldest profession comes under that description, I don't know. But right, so Helen asked this question, which is a very good one. That if Kant's position in the Critique of Pure Reason is right, that all of our knowledge is from our own point of view, then how can he ever be entitled to abstract from that point of view towards laws that apply to everyone? That's the thought, isn't it? And I think this is a very important difficulty which we have to address. And I think although I can't deal with this all now, I think the most important point to say is that in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's not arguing that I know the world simply from my point of view. I know it from the point of view that I share with others, which is the point of view of possible experience. That's how he puts it. So the world that I know is one that I share with others, but I only share with them because they also share that particular point of view. It's not an individual point of view, it's a collective one, but it's one that is, as it were, made available by experience itself. And in a similar way, the moral point of view is made available by reason itself, and it takes the form of these abstract principles. So that's how I think those two could be reconciled. But the gentleman behind you raised the question again about the social side of moral judgment, and suggesting that Kant's moral philosophy, certainly as I've expounded it, doesn't address any particular social forms. And is this because he had a different idea of the social from those which Hegel and then Marx had, or because he's just ignoring it? I think he did have a lot of thoughts about the social. He wrote an interesting book called Anthropology from a practical standpoint, in which he gives probably the first attempt to give a philosophical anthropology of the human condition. It is true that his own social milieu was quite a confined one, but he had I think a dinner party every day, and he never went beyond the walls of Königsberg, and when he did want to get married, he only briefly he only pursued the woman as far as the gates of But, so he was obviously not the same kind of social creature as Hegel or Marx. There were, however, many people, his contemporaries, who did think of the moral life as rooted in the experience of community, the most famous being Hume, whose social observations are extremely pertinent, and Adam Smith, likewise, in his book on the moral sentiments. So it was at that time perfectly normal to associate the moral thinking with our experience of community. Kant was perhaps the exception to this in saying that it must have another basis. If you just associate it with the experience of community, you'll never distinguish the categorical from the hypothetical forms of reasoning that govern our lives. So, anyway, that's then the young lady next to you produced some frightening authorities. Now, I have to say that certainly a lot of things have occurred in the 20th and 21st century to have this effect which you call problematizing subjectivity. And you refer to, I think, Bergson, but I think it's really more Husserl, the idea that all our states of mind have to be seen not purely in terms of subjective awareness of them, but more particularly in terms of their intentional direction. And that is absolutely true. One would have to expound this in a slightly different way to satisfy that requirement. Whether this idea of the other, which you associate with Lacan, made any great difference is one of those issues which will never be solved in my lifetime, might be in yours. The idea of the other came crashing into French philosophy as a result of the lectures on Hegel's phenomenology given by a man called Alexandre Kojève, who was a Russian exile in Paris between the wars, and it entered not just Lacan's thinking, but all the people who attended his lectures. That was Sartre and de Beauvoir, a whole stream of them, and they all came up with this idea that the concept of the other is an all-important part of our human understanding, and without it, we can't really make sense of the human world. And my own view is that with it, Lacan failed to make sense of the human world. I have to say I'm particularly grateful for something in his seminaire, his proof of that in bourgeois conditions, the erectile penis is equivalent to the square root of -1. It's a brilliant proof, using all kinds of jargon from Saussurian linguistics. But I encountered it as a teenager in Paris, and I'm afraid it changed my life. It was 30 years until I got married. In short, I think he's a fraud, but in Heidegger's case, you're absolutely right. Heidegger views the subjectivity as deeply rooted in the experience of time, not the experience, in our being in time, and that it's only if we fully understand our being in time that we'll know what it is that our being subjects tells us. And that's absolutely true. It's a profound thought, but it's there in Kant too. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he actually argues, as he puts it, that time is the form of inner sense. In other words, that thing which presents me with the sense of myself is the order of time. Joel said, what about the other two postulates of practical reason? I didn't touch on this. Kant wanted to derive from his moral philosophy a kind of theology, a theological appendix, in which he said that, in fact, all of this only makes sense because we are postulating human freedom. And I've already touched on that it's something that we can't fully understand, we just know it's true. And he wanted to go on and say we must also postulate the existence of God and the immortality of the person if we are to make sense of the kind of reasoning that morality of its own nature thrusts upon us. And I would say that is not true, that we can make sense of this reasoning. I've done it. Okay, I may not have persuaded you, but I made sense of it without those postulates. Whether, though, that it gives us some kind of ground for thinking those things is another matter. And I'm inclined to think that it does, but that's a different point. Bruno, I think, says that what happens in conflict where the majority wants to impose its will upon the minority because the minority is not behaving in a Kantian way. Well, we're in that situation, aren't we? We always have been, probably. And the majority imposes its, if it's a Kantian majority, it imposes its will through the rule of law. And those non-Kantians who want to conspire against us will have to take the consequences.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, and we are going to just take 5 or so, one question each, very, very quickly. Roger, don't feel you need to come back on all of them because there won't be time. Just use what you will from them to sum up and send us to know where we can or cannot get drunk. Alan.
Well, thank you for making it so clear and entertaining. I think obviously the historical importance that you laid out between the subject to the object and predicting and deciding, it's made it very clear and easy to understand. I suppose where my question comes in is, how does the, and you alluded to it, and it's always difficult when you're looking back at things, but you alluded to it when you pointed out to Hegel, maybe went beyond this in terms of conflict, as opposed to your consultation, consent and compromise. But at what point, how does that relationship work with the categorical imperative? Is it just that some people have some conflicts based on new ideas of what is right? And can you still use the categorical imperative? Is it just that it just has to change? Is it just about a matter of numbers? And at what point does that change from one thing to the next and still retain its credibility?
Okay, so Sabina in the middle, and then Ahubia over there. Quick.
Yeah, okay, quick. I was a bit disturbed by some of the rather, let's say, skeptical questions, although every question is legitimate, but it seemed to me maybe some point was being missed, and that's my question to you. Isn't the real relevance in Kant, comparing it to the Reformation and Luther we were talking about before, is to see how he developed the idea of the individual further. Because before, when we had Luther, and his notion that the individual is now given authority through faith, all of a sudden he is becoming a different kind of person. Well, in Kant, isn't it the case that the real point is that this moves one step ahead, and now it's no longer faith, but it's the individual and its innate faculties itself that make him this wondrous being which has a high authority and indeed freedom. And that's historically, wouldn't you agree, the real importance of that step in philosophy?
Okay, Ahubia, quicker than that. And then Jacob back there. So, there, just behind you, Rob. No, I'm sitting there. In the end, there, yeah. Sorry.
How then, in your view, would Kant respond? How then, in your view, would Kant respond to arguments about the law, which may be inconsistent or incomplete arguments which have been made and which are very rigorous in themselves against the completeness of axiomatic systems?
Against what?
The completeness of axiomatic systems, for example, and therefore the existence of axiomatic systems as complete, reliable frameworks for being.
Okay, so Jacob at the back, and can I just see all the hands up who really want to speak? Okay.
I just moved on really quick from what you just said.
Yeah, go on. No, can't. You would wait. Jacob.
I guess I'm worried about how we know we're free. And
How we know
we're free as free wills. And I think that Kant poses a very difficult question to us because he sometimes seems to suggest that we exist
like new, and therefore we can't ever know anything about ourselves. And Kristen Korsgaard in her interpretation said it's like, for Kant it's an impossible question to ask how we can even exist on the boundary between the phenomenal and the normal world. For me, I guess it just worried me. Does it mean that essentially morality is based on this one giant gamble, that we are actually free?
Okay, you want the mic over right at the very back. Yeah.
Yes, my question is to an earlier part of what you were saying about moral reasoning, different to if you like, other types of reasoning, but it's not about what is, it's not about reality, it's about what ought to be. And I was just wondering, can you make such a clear separation? Is it really true that ideals, I mean, how can ideals have no element of reality, otherwise how would they change historically? There must be some relationship there, whereas you seem to be separating them rather too sharply.
Yeah, good question. Okay, really, really quick. So, Jude there, and then last one, Dennis.
Just on the subject of law, since the rise of critical legal theory, Kant's pure legal theory is being sort of sidelined. I just wondered if you thought his theory still stood up.
Jason, Dennis there.
Does not this condition or gift, if you like, that we as humans have, that you refer to as reason and Kant has, does it not preclude free will?
Okay, so if I can get you in over time. Roger.
Yeah, well, gosh, the questions are going further and further afield. I might as well just try and take them in order. It was Alan, wasn't it? How does the categorical imperative help with conflict resolution, essentially? And does it leave us in a better situation, something like that? You can think of all these appeals to the abstract principles of reason in another way, in the way that Adam Smith thinks of them in his theory of the moral sentiments, which is a different book, of course, but Adam Smith was feeling his way towards the same thing, in which there he argues that we often think that our conflicts have no resolution until we imagine ourselves in the position of an impartial judge, somebody who has no interest in their outcomes. And then we step back and we will very quickly see, as in the judgment of Solomon, who is right and who is wrong. And that's really what Kant is doing in a different way. Smith is putting it in a social context, but Kant is saying, look, we have that social context, as it were, always within us. We can always put ourselves in the position of the impartial judge. And then we see who is right and who is wrong. And if parties to a conflict can both do this, then the resolution is there. The problem is, we are overcome by passion and by what he calls pathological motives that prevent us from doing this. Yes, Sabina, is it right? Said the questions have been too sceptical. That Kant is really trying to say that we're moving on from Luther's reliance on faith into a new conception of the moral life, in which we have the authority within ourselves. We don't have to submit to an authority outside ourselves, which is what faith is asking us to do. The authority is there. The light of reason shines in us all, and that is true. That's exactly what he was doing, and it's why he was so influential, because he didn't just say that, he produced an incredibly powerful argument for thinking that it must be true. But then we have this question of law, which came twice. So one was the gentleman over there who said, how do we respond to how would Kant respond to the idea that law is in itself, moves in the direction of some kind of axiomatic system, and then you raise the question that axiomatic systems have been put in question by proofs like Gödel's proof, I suppose you have in mind, that proofs of incompleteness and so on. I'm not sure that that is strictly relevant, but another lady here said that, I can't remember that, yes, Sarah, said that nevertheless, the Kantian approach to law as something axiomatic with an authority independent of social context and so on have been put in question by critical legal theory. Now, it has certainly been put in question in the sense that the question has been asked, but I don't think critical legal theory actually works. It doesn't actually subvert the Kantian approach to law. I think it is a gesture based upon a kind of application to the philosophy of law of various Frankfurt School conceptions of what a human community is. And I think it peters out in a load of jargon. But it may be that I'm prejudiced, or at least I hope I am prejudiced, because you can't get through life without prejudices, and this is the right area to have them. But nevertheless, it still, I think it still needs to be proved. Jacob said, how do we know we're free? Doesn't this, there's nothing in Kant which tells us that we really must accept this, or something like that. And he's really asking us to base morality on a kind of gigantic gamble. But then, of course, if what he's saying is right, it could be that the assumption that we're not free is also a gigantic gamble. And so, and what would happen if you base morality on that? You know, it wouldn't get you halfway to the satisfactory position that he gets you. So, you know, perhaps sometimes in the end, one has to take intellectual gambles when it comes to the unprovable. The lady at the back rightly said that, of course, ideals have to be related to reality. They're not just fairy tales. They are representations of how the world ought to be if those forces and things contained in it are satisfactorily brought to fruition. And that's what Kant really means by the kingdom of ends. He doesn't mean that it's a completely unreal place. He means it's the human world as it really should be if we acted out properly those things which are best in us. So it has got a reality component in it. And the last question seemed to suggest that reason precludes free will. But Kant's point is that, properly understood, reason and free will are the same idea. But they're the same idea, but described from a completely different point of view.